Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse and more specifically beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you're watching on, assuming that you're watching live, and they will show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And today is Friday. It's our weekly Roundup day when I talk about interesting stories from around the world, theoretically news stories, but whatever might be interesting. And we do have a couple of interesting things today. Some a little closer to news, others just, I think, of interest to you. So I am going to talk about them, assuming that time allows. First, I want to mention that today is National Garlic Day. And hello to Reverend Mary in the chat room. Reverend Mary and I did Tarot Thursday last night, which was great fun. And it was very interesting. At one point, we both had thunderstorms going on that, for the most part, I don't think anyone else was aware of, but it was interesting. Um, but today is National Garlic Day, and it is a good day to appreciate our my favorite condiment, my favorite spice, garlic, and we are also coming up on Earth Day. Earth Day will be on Monday, which is April 22nd. And hello to Mary Cavalcante in the chat room. And Earth Day, of course, honors the Earth, our mother, Mother Nature, the physical basis of our existence. It's a time to think about the Earth, um, its condition, and its future. And we talked about this on Monday of this week, and tomorrow at Earth Spirit Emporium here in downtown Danville, I will be doing an Earth Day ritual at 2 p.m. Central Time, and we will be broadcasting it through Earth Spirit Emporium. If you want to take part, please feel free to join us. And Mary says, "Yay, Earth and garlic!" And yes, what a great way to start. I I'm a great believer in garlic and other interesting spices. I am not known for plain food. I like complex flavors. And this started not exactly on the realm of news, but I was telling this story the other day. Um, when I was first moving out into the world, and in those days, I wanted to travel the world and see all kinds of exotic places, some of which, in fact, I have traveled to and seen, others I have not. But one of the things that occurred to me as I started having a wider range of international food was that I wasn't going to have a lot of luck traveling the world if I could not eat the food that was going to be there. And being a Midwesterner, I was not originally accustomed to highly spiced food, although probably more than most Midwesterners. And I made up my mind that, I was going to acclimate myself to um, to a wide range of cuisines, and I did so. And today, I'm hard pressed to think of any cuisine that I do not enjoy at least some items of, and in most cases, everything. Um, and many of those are highly spiced cuisines. And Mary Cavalcante says, as a Sicilian Italian, I love spice also. Yes, um, spice is the spice of life. And Mary Hawk says, and chicken livers. Yes, I do. I do like chicken livers. I'm also a great believer in the idea that if you're going to be a meat eater and you're going to eat meat, then you should not waste any part of the animals that die for this purpose. Every now and then, I see people who are upset, usually with the meat that goes into sausages. But this is why we have sausages. They're to use up the pieces that aren't considered highly desirable, but in their final form, they're perfectly desirable. And I think that is very much the correct thing to do with anything that you're going to eat, that you want to use as much as you can, and not be wasting, uh, not be wasting the lost life of whatever it is that you're eating. Because whatever you're eating, whether it was a plant or an animal, was alive before you were eating it. And it that fact we must stop and respect, and we must consider what we are consuming and what we're not consuming, and how we are using or wasting the things that we are eating and living on. And that brings us back to Earth Day, which is all about considering how we're using and wasting the planet that we're living on. On Monday, I was talking about how severe pollution was when I was a child. And the fact that at my age, I remember those days. And if you're around my age, you probably will too. And just how much better things got for a long time. If you're older than me, which there are increasingly few people who can say that, but if you're older than me, you'll remember that it was even worse earlier. I was talking about how cities used to be overlaid with clouds of pollution that, um, in some cases, were so heavy that they made sunny days overcast because of the smoke coming from the factories. Made it very hard to breathe if you had any kind of sensitivity at all, and even if you didn't. Um, and this was things like industrial, as well as household pollution, both of which were far greater than, and of course, livestock pollution, which we tend to totally forget about. But in the days when our primary transportation were horses, they produced their own um, polluting factors that made for interesting times in high population centers. And all of these things we have, over the course of generations, worked to clean up. Um, the purple haze that used to hang over any public gathering because of the vast amount of smoking that was going on, you don't see that now. If you're a younger person, you won't even know what I'm talking about, unless possibly you're watching an old movie and might see it there. And if you're old enough to remember these things, you probably will agree with me that we're far better off without all of those things in our air and in our water. Um, and I'm very distressed to see that in some ways we seem to be going back to those bad practices. Um, and Reverend Mary in the chat room says, my grandparents' argument for smoking was that it wasn't any worse than breathing Chattanooga factory smoke air. And that's probably entirely true. Um, but it's not an argument for smoking; it's an argument against breathing the factory smoke air. But no, they were probably right about that. One of the things we don't understand is how polluted our environment used to be. And we're aware that before modern heating arrangements, people heated their houses with fireplaces. We're not aware of how that, depending on the quality of the house and the era we're talking about, how that polluted the air that they were breathing every day. Um, Eventually, that technology became very sophisticated, but it didn't start out that way. And before fireplaces, which aren't that old, it was an open fire in the middle of the room. And even many of the great castles that we think of as being so beautiful and romantic were built in an era when what you did for heat was build a fire in the middle of the Great Hall, and you would have had smoke everywhere. It was a very different lifestyle. And knowing what we know now about the dangers of breathing in all these particles, it was a much less healthy lifestyle. I I was reading last night, moving on to something more news related, about a case. in Montana, which I think is considered the town in question, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's considered one of the most polluted, uh, or was one of the most polluted places in the country, because of a mine there that exported large amounts of asbestos, and that the mesothelioma rate was and is, even 20 years after all of this stopped, off the books. It's a huge issue. And even though they stopped with the pollution, people who were exposed to it at the time are still coming down with the disease, because the nature of that particular disease does not get better just because it's in the past. And hello to Nikki in the chat room. And as we come up on Earth Day, these are things we should stop and think about. One of the things that I've always kind of ignored, but certainly been aware of, is purple lung disease. And if you're not familiar with purple lung, I'm sure that you've heard of black lung disease. You may have heard of pink lung disease, which is something that in the past affected, and still to some extent, I'm sure, affects people in the garment industry, people working with fabrics and breathing in the residue of that process. And purple lung disease is something that sometimes affects people who work in creative fields and work with markers like this and breathe in the fumes of them, and paints and other things. It's one of the reasons why, if you look at modern creative practices, you will often see people using face masks when they work with certain kinds of paint. Something that when I was young, nobody would ever have thought of doing, because we had no idea such a thing could happen. And all of these are things that affect our lives in very personal ways under the right circumstances, or maybe I should say under the wrong circumstances. But we're rarely really conscious of them. And as we look at Earth Day, and as we consider being part of a religion that venerates nature, we really should be looking at these things. We should be looking at the great improvements we have made, the need for more, and the number of people who, for whatever reason, are not happy with the improvements and want to go backward, and what that actually means. And what it means is not good health. Um, but if you're a person, oh, say you're in your 20s or 30s, you won't remember these things. You won't know what it was like. So you may not understand why it's been such a good thing to move forward in getting rid of so much pollution, but let me assure you it is. Now, because this is our roundup of news stories, I do have an actual news story for you. Um, and I have really only one other news story. And then I'm going to talk about some books, which aren't really news, but they may be books you've not heard about and might find interesting. But this story is about the misfits of God. And you may have seen this story this week. And it is about a small group of conservative Christians who called themselves, quote, God's misfits, end quote. Um, and it is the story of the murder of two young women. These two young women were killed in Oklahoma, and the people who killed them were part of the group God's Misfits, which is a conservative religious group, which is also an anti-government group, despite the fact that one of the members was the chairperson of the local Republican Party. So obviously not completely anti-government. Um, and it is unfortunately, I think, a case of which we may be seeing more in the future, because these people found it completely appropriate to move to violence to get their way. Now, this was not a political murder. It was a very personal murder. It was about a woman who basically arranged the murder of her former daughter-in-law um, in relationship to the custody of her grandchildren. And along with the daughter-in-law, they also murdered a caseworker. The daughter was Veronica Butler. The caseworker was Gillian Kelly, and um, they were murdered in Texas County, Oklahoma, apparently on March 30th. And four people have been arrested for this. And first and foremost is the grandmother, who basically has admitted responsibility for, I guess, ordering the murder. And what does this have to do with us? Well, there's a certain level where it has inherently nothing to do with us or with politics. This is obviously a very personal situation. And if it were not part of a larger pattern, it wouldn't have anything to do with us. Um, it is, however, a long-term pattern of groups with a certain religious and political bent being willing to turn to violence to get what they want, which is often very personal in its immediate expression, but political in its aspects as well. Um, we can go back through the history of the last almost 2,000 years and see this kind of thing happening frequently, that people from a certain background feel that moving to violence is not an issue, that that they're empowered by God to take up people's lives, and that's what happened here. The fact that this was a personal issue does not change the fact that the reason they felt that they could do this was a religious and political issue. I've talked frequently about Christian nationalism and Christian dominionism, and one of the dangers of this is the willingness to move to violence. And here's another little story about a situation where these people, and you can look this up online for yourself and see all the details, but they had made very clear that they were looking to use violence to get what they wanted months before they did it, and nobody stopped them. Um, and we want to say hello to Christine in the chat room. Hello to Nikki in the chat room. It's good to see you both. Um, and this is something that presents a couple of issues, because on one hand, you don't want to have a situation where someone making an exaggerated statement out of exasperation is treated too seriously. But on the other hand, when people are threatening people's lives um, repeatedly, I think it should be taken more seriously than it is being taken. But as I look back on my lifetime, and I think that if you think about it also, you'll notice that very often, one, they're not taken very seriously. And often, if they fall into a certain social background, they're kind of given a free pass, particularly if they're certain kinds of Christians. And one of the things I remember, and if you're my age, you'll remember this too, is that back in the 70s, um, there were a lot of high profile cases where people would go to prison. This happened with a lot of the Watergate people, that, as I recall, suddenly become devout Christians and be let out of prison early for this reason. They were treating it as a get out of prison card, basically. And then did they remain devout Christians? Of course not. Um, it was a stance they took to avoid the responsibilities for their action, but they were allowed to do so because of people's preconceived ideas. And I think this is still an issue, and I think this might be part of why this um, grandmother was basically allowed to conduct these killings. And now, not only are these two women dead, um, these children's lives probably already substantially damaged, but much more so now. Um, and the other people she involved in the crime, all of their lives are severely damaged. And a lot of it on the basis of being, quote, God's misfits, um, being um, in what they considered a religiously privileged position. And that's bad. It's something we need to keep our eye on. And, I'm not overly happy with the fact that my weekly roundup seems to keep coming back to this subject, but I do think we need to have our eye on it. And that's all the news stories I have for this half hour. Um, you may be happy for that. You may be disappointed for that. I don't know. Um, but those are the ones that I particularly noticed for this week. But I had also noticed publicity for a book that I wanted to stop and recommend. It's not really new, but it caught my attention, and it's part of this same message. So the book is called The Darkening Age. And it's The Darkening Age, The Christian Destruction of the Classical World, published in 2017 and written by Catherine Nixie. And this is a book which talks about the change from classical antiquity to um, the coming of Christian Europe. And it is apparently rather strongly written, but it's quite worth reading if you're pagan. And I have a couple of other books I'm going to put with it in a moment, but I want to talk a little bit about what this book talks about, because it's very relevant to, one, the subject we're talking about today, in terms of the news story we were just looking at. It's also relevant to a subject I've spoken about before, which is academic bias on this particular subject. A lot of the academic world really wants to stand by the idea that the classical world just voluntarily suddenly went from millennia old traditions to a brand new religion in a very simple and peaceful manner that everybody was on board with and wanted to see happen. And certainly there could have been no pagan survivals from. And this has been the dominant press release of the last 2,000 years, but it's not true. And any reasonable look at the records of the time show that that's not true. And this book is a reasonable look at the records of the time. So if you have an interest in how Europe became Christian, and then many other parts of the world, this is a good book to start with. And it talks about things like, one, the rather biased way that pre-Christian antiquity is commonly portrayed, um, which tends to make it look um, very undesirable. But if you look at the reality, it was a society like any other, with many advantages and disadvantages, um, and certainly much deeper than it's often shown. But, for example, there's a quote that you often hear in the context um, of the Christianizing of the Roman Empire, and that is a quote from Cicero: "I believe in the God, or I honor the gods, but I do not believe in them," which is often taken to suggest that Roman religion was already basically dead, and Christianity just peacefully stepped in to replace it. The problem with that is that's not what Cicero was saying at all. Um, the thing that Cicero was saying, Cicero was a spiritualist, very much like modern spiritualists. And what he was saying is that his private devotions were to the ancestral spirits, not so much the public devotions to the state gods. It's a whole aspect of Greco Roman religion which is very important and pretty much universal and almost never remarked upon by many people who write about it. Um, and often, again, taken out of context by people who take just that one line but don't look at what he was actually saying. Um, there is a lot of attempt to suggest that classical society was very cold, very unfulfilling, very nihilistic, and the reality is it was none of those things. For the most part, people were leading their lives the same way we lead our lives within the context of their civilization, and most of them were quite happy about it, and they weren't looking for a new religion for the most part. So the book talks about things like the famous murder of Hypatia, um, the destruction of various pagan temples and statuary, the destruction of the libraries, and the resistance of people to the destruction of their culture. The fact that they did not jump on this train and go along with it, and in some cases, um, strenuously resisted it as long as they could. And hello to Mystique in the chat room. Um, and one of the things that's worth noting is that some of the pagan festivals continued as much as 200 years into the Christian era, being publicly celebrated, not because they were a relic of the past, but because people weren't willing to give them up. And the idea that other things continued less officially much longer after, in addition to being something that you can easily trace in the record, is something that a large number of people, including, I think, most academics, are vehemently opposed um, to accepting, but not for good reasons. So a book like this, I think, is very well worth the reading, um, in talking about how these things happened, the ideas that were behind them, and the resistance to them. Now, I have two other books that I wanted to recommend to you at the same time. And again, this was The Darkening Age by Catherine Nixie, and came out in 2017. It's quite recent. The next one is called The Christians as the Romans Saw Them, and this was published in 1984. It's quite an old book by comparison, but it deals with all the same subjects, um, and and I'm sure they each have some subjects the others don't. It is another really excellent look at how the classical world became Christianized and how this was not, for most people, a voluntary process at all. And there was tremendous resistance to it. Long after most people, um, most authorities will tell you the process was complete, people were still resisting it. It was nowhere near as quick, nowhere near as thorough as a lot of people would like to portray it. And Mary says, my to read list keeps getting longer and longer. Why, yes, indeed. And there's one more in this little group that I want to recommend to you. But that one was The Christians as the Romans Saw Them by Robert L. Wilkin. And the last one is Christianizing the Roman Empire, AD 100 through 400 by Ramsay MacMullen. And this was also published in 1984. And I will tell you, I bought both of these right around the time they were published. And they're both well worth reading to give you an idea of what was really going on. That's mostly not the version you're going to get. They're well researched, they're well documented. They're absolutely academic if that's something that is appealing to you, in the sense that they are well researched and well documented. But they're not the story that you're usually going to get, and it's well worth the looking at. And with that, I see that we're coming to the end of our half hour. In fact, we're at the end of our half hour, but I have one more thing to say. And we mentioned the murder of Hypatia, the great Alexandrian scholar, who's generally looked at as a pagan martyr. And there was a movie several years ago called Hypatia, about the lady and her murder. And she was shown as this um, beautiful young girl fighting um, valiantly to preserve classical antiquity in the face of rising Christianity. And that's usually the story that you get when you see depictions of Hypatia. Um, she is usually shown as rather model-esque. One of the things that's worth mentioning about Hypatia in a wider frame is that she was in her 60s. She was a highly respected matron, um, not a beautiful young model. And in a world with an awful lot of anti-aging prejudice, especially toward women, that's important to remember, that she was not a maiden fighting the forces of darkness, but a crone fighting the forces of darkness. And in no uncertain terms, that's exactly what I would describe the fight as being, and in the end, kind of the fight we're still in. And once again, our roundup has been all about the fight against the forces of, we'll say the forces of darkness, the forces of destruction, and those who, once again, want to send the world into the Dark Ages. And Mary says, "Yay, crone." Yes, indeed. That's why I mentioned it. With that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. I hope that you enjoyed the program. Watch for my Earth Day ritual tomorrow at Earth Spirit Emporium with Jazrick Garman, and watch for me to return with Midday with Rev Don on Monday. And with that, let us end with our prayer, as we always do. And Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to help us to be mindful of the freedoms that we enjoy and the planet on which we live, and help us to work to protect both. Help us to work to protect and improve the environment in which we all live, and to be mindful of the dangers of allowing that environment to degrade. Help us also to be mindful of the need to protect our political rights and the civilization that we wish to live in, the one that gives us freedom to move forward, and the fact that it is not a perfect world and one in which more progress is still needed. And help us to be devoted to making that progress. Help us in both of these areas and all others to do the next right thing as we go forward. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks. And knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always.